Comrades, listen well. From the cradle, the child learns first to obey. Before the taste of truth, before the comprehension of right and wrong, before the understanding of justice, obedience is hammered into the mind. Why? Because the ruling class fears the awakening of reason, for reason is the enemy of domination, the liberator of the oppressed. The system does not teach justice, it teaches submission. It does not foster inquiry, it fosters compliance. And in this submission the machinery of exploitation whirs, silent and invisible, while the working class is moulded into instruments of its own oppression. Observe society. The school teaches the child to follow orders. The factory instructs the worker to endure. The law demands obedience, yet rarely delivers justice. From family to state, hierarchy is naturalized, authority is sanctified. The worker is told, serve and you shall survive. But justice, true justice, is revolutionary. It demands questioning, it demands defiance, it demands the overturning of the chains that bind the many to the profit of the few. Why is obedience instilled before justice? Because the rulers of capital understand that a people educated in submission cannot challenge the structures of exploitation. When justice is delayed, obedience becomes instinct, and instinct is easier to manipulate than intellect. The system reproduces itself by convincing the oppressed that the world is just, that wealth and poverty are natural, that the authority which commands is the authority which should be obeyed. But this is a lie. It is a lie that serves the owners of capital and the architects of inequality. Look at the streets, the factories, the offices. Observe the wage slavery that chains the hands and the minds of the many. The labourer produces vast wealth, yet the fruits are confiscated by the few who do nothing but command. Obedience has been taught, but justice is withheld. And so the proletariat lives in a world that glorifies hierarchy while punishing dissent, that promises law but denies equity, that offers civility while concealing exploitation. Comrades, the time has come to awaken. Obedience must be unlearned, and justice must be claimed. The workers, the peasants, the oppressed of all lands, must recognize that the chains are not eternal, that authority is not sacred, that the laws of men are not the laws of right. Organization is our weapon, solidarity our shield, and knowledge our spark. Only in unity can the working class overturn the falsehoods of obedience and erect the foundations of true justice. Let the teachers of obedience tremble, for the educated proletariat will question every command. Let the judges of hierarchy quake, for the awakened masses will demand equity. Let the masters of capital despair, for the oppressed, armed with consciousness and solidarity, will no longer labour in silence. They will labour for liberation. Justice is not given, it is seized. Freedom is not granted, it is taken. And obedience, that false virtue, will crumble before the conscious power of the organized many. The revolution is not a dream, it is the historical necessity born of inequality, of exploitation, of the centuries of obedience that have been taught at the expense of justice. Comrades, rise, cast off the chains of submission. Educate yourselves in the principles of truth, equality, and justice. Organize, agitate, and confront the structures that oppress you. Let the world hear the clarion call of the many, and let the age of obedience perish in the flame of revolutionary consciousness. The time is now. Justice will come, not from the masters of obedience, but from the hands and minds of the workers themselves. And when it comes, it will not ask permission. It will demand nothing less than the liberation of all humanity. From the earliest moments of life, the child is moulded into the framework demanded by society, and in this moulding, obedience is the first lesson imposed. Before the mind has the capacity to question the nature of fairness or the foundations of right and wrong, the child is instructed to follow rules, respect authority, and accept hierarchy as natural. This instruction is not innocent or accidental. It is deliberate, calculated, and designed to sustain the existing order. The power structures of society recognize that those who obey without reflection are easier to govern, easier to exploit, and easier to consign to roles that serve the interests of the few who hold wealth, property, and influence. Obedience becomes a habit, a reflex, and an internalized framework through which individuals approach the world, and within this framework, the concept of justice is delayed, deferred, or distorted. Those who teach obedience understand that the unexamined mind is pliable, and pliability is the foundation of control. By instilling submission before critical awareness, the dominant classes ensure that future generations accept conditions that are neither natural nor inevitable but artificially maintained by the concentration of power and the manipulation of social institutions. Obedience in this sense is not merely a behavioral expectation, it is an ideological weapon. It is a tool by which the ruling class secures the reproduction of its own dominance, ensuring that the laborer, the peasant, the worker, and the oppressed do not perceive the mechanisms of their exploitation until they are already entrenched within them. The child learns that authority is to be trusted, that the commands of teachers, parents, police, and rulers are to be followed without question, and that resistance is dangerous, unwelcome, or immoral. The rules of obedience are embedded in schooling, in the rites of socialization, in the systems of reward and punishment that condition behavior from infancy. Every lesson, every expectation, every enforced norm reinforces the notion that compliance is virtuous and deviation is punishable. Yet justice, the recognition of fairness, equality, and the equitable distribution of resources and rights, is conspicuously absent from this early instruction. Justice requires reflection, critical thinking, and the capacity to recognize imbalance and oppression. It demands that individuals question why some prosper while others suffer, why labor produces wealth that is concentrated in the hands of the few, and why social hierarchies persist in defiance of reason. Justice is inherently subversive because it undermines the legitimacy of the existing social order. It challenges authority by demanding that the rules be scrutinized, the laws be tested against morality, and the claims of rulers be measured against the interests of the many rather than the privileges of the few. By teaching obedience first, the system preemptively disarms the population against such scrutiny. The obedient mind is conditioned to accept explanations, to follow instructions, and to defer judgment to those in positions of authority. This conditioning extends into adulthood, where the structures of the workplace, the legal system, and political institutions continue to demand compliance, while simultaneously withholding fairness. The factory worker is taught to follow the pace of production, the office clerk to execute orders, and the citizen to obey laws that often protect property and capital rather than human dignity. Obedience is reinforced as a virtue, while justice is postponed, minimized, or abstracted as an ideal rather than practice reality. In this way, the ruling classes reproduce themselves not only through material wealth, but also through psychological and ideological control. Those who obey without questioning are unlikely to mobilize against injustice, to challenge exploitative labor, to demand redistribution, or to confront the inequalities embedded in social, economic, and political systems. Obedience becomes a preemptive form of oppression, shaping the consciousness of the oppressed before they have the tools to recognize or resist their own subjugation. The deliberate prioritization of obedience over justice ensures that the machinery of exploitation functions smoothly, that labor is extracted efficiently, and that dissent is minimized. It is a sophisticated and insidious method by which domination is normalized, and it operates through education, culture, religion, and law, forming a network of influence that subtly but actively maintains inequality across generations. By the time the individual reaches maturity, obedience is ingrained, reflexive, and socially rewarded, while the principles of justice remain theoretical, aspirational, and often inaccessible, leaving the oppressed conditioned to perpetuate the very system that exploits them. The ruling class does not merely exploit the labor of the many through overt coercion or visible force, it secures its dominance through subtler, more insidious mechanisms, chief among them the normalization of submission. From the earliest stages of social life, institutions of authority, schools, religious organizations, government structures, and economic systems shape the consciousness of individuals to accept hierarchy as natural and obedience as virtuous. By presenting submission not as a condition imposed but as a moral duty, the ruling class ensures that the population internalizes the mechanisms of its own oppression, transforming external domination into self-regulation. The worker, the peasant, the citizen is trained to accept commands, to respect the dictates of those in power, and to equate compliance with goodness, loyalty, and propriety. In this manner, inequality is not only maintained through wealth and material control, but is reinforced ideologically, embedded in the very perception of what constitutes a legitimate social order. When submission is normalized, the structures of oppression are rendered invisible. They are perceived not as products of human design, but as natural, inevitable, and unchangeable. Education is a primary vehicle for this normalization. The child is instructed to sit quietly, follow rules, respect authority, defer to those in positions of power. The praise of obedience and the punishment of dissent instill a psychological framework in which conformity becomes synonymous with virtue and resistance with immorality. From this foundation, the individual grows into adulthood conditioned to accept not only the authority of immediate superiors, but the broader hierarchy of class, wealth, and privilege. Workplaces replicate this pattern by embedding obedience into the very structure of labor. The factory floor, the office, the shop, and the field demand compliance with schedules, procedures, and managerial directives, teaching the worker that productivity is bound to submission. Any challenge to authority is met with sanction, exclusion, or dismissal, reinforcing the message that questioning the social order is not only futile but dangerous. The law reinforces this dynamic by privileging property and capital while ostensibly claiming universality. It punishes transgression against private ownership far more rigorously than transgression against human dignity or well-being. The structures of justice themselves are designed to reinforce submission, requiring that grievances be addressed through hierarchical channels that rarely challenge the underlying inequities of society. Religion and ideology operate in tandem with these material and institutional forces, providing moral justification for social inequality. The narrative that obedience to authority is righteous, that social hierarchies are ordained, and that poverty is virtuous while wealth is evidence of merit serves to mask exploitation. By framing submission as a moral obligation, the ruling class cultivates a populace willing to perpetuate its own subjugation. Propaganda and culture further normalize obedience by celebrating stories of compliance, portraying rebellion as reckless or immoral, and glorifying the success of those who conform to the system's demands. In every domain, from education to employment, from law to ideology, the ruling class shapes consciousness to accept hierarchy as natural and power as legitimate. The result is that inequality is no longer only a matter of material disparity, but a matter of perception, internalized belief, and social expectation. The worker learns to measure success not by freedom or equity, but by the degree to which one aligns with existing authority. The oppressed are trained to police themselves, to regulate desires, ambitions, and actions in accordance with what the powerful dictate, and to interpret structural exploitation as the natural order of things. This self-regulation is perhaps the most insidious tool of domination, for it renders direct coercion less necessary. When submission is normalized, the majority consents to its own exploitation, defends the legitimacy of the few who profit from it, and often acts to suppress dissent among peers, ensuring that collective resistance remains fragmented and ineffective. By embedding obedience into morality, education, culture, and law, the ruling class perpetuates inequality not only through wealth and force, but through the very consciousness of the oppressed, creating a society in which hierarchy is accepted, exploitation is justified, and the possibility of collective liberation is deferred indefinitely. Submission becomes a habit, obedience a reflex, and the structures of domination are reproduced. From generation to generation, secure in their invisibility and reinforced in the minds of those who live under them. True justice cannot exist within a framework of passive acceptance, for justice is not a gift bestowed by rulers, nor is it a principle recognized voluntarily by those whose power depends upon inequality. Justice demands the awakening of consciousness, the refusal to accept the apparent inevitability of exploitation, and the courage to confront the structures that sustain oppression. To recognize justice is to recognize the disparities embedded in society, to see the vast wealth produced by labor yet accumulated by the few, to observe the machinery of laws and institutions that claim fairness while perpetuating privilege. It is not sufficient to accept the appearances of equality or the illusions of fairness offered by those who profit from submission. Justice is not an abstract concept to be admired from a distance, but a living principle that requires action, defiance, and the organization of those who have been silenced, marginalized, and exploited. The first step toward true justice is questioning. Questioning is the spark that ignites revolutionary thought. The oppressed must ask why labor produces abundance that benefits only a small minority, why poverty is criminalized while wealth is sanctified, why the social order privileges obedience over equity. Questioning is dangerous to the powerful because it undermines the legitimacy of their authority. It exposes the contradictions within a system that preaches freedom but practices exploitation, that celebrates civility but enforces hierarchy, that promises law but delivers injustice. Every question raised by the oppressed is a threat to the status quo, a fissure in the edifice of domination, a challenge to the narrati. Ves designed to sustain submission. Yet questioning alone is not sufficient. To move from awareness to justice, questioning must evolve into defiance. Defiance is the refusal to accept commands, regulations, or social norms that serve the interests of the few at the expense of the many. It is the moral and practical rejection of a system that profits from obedience and punishes resistance. Defiance manifests in speech, in organization, in acts of solidarity that challenge the authority of those who exploit labor, extract profit, and monopolize power. Defiance is visible in the strikes of workers who refuse to labor for the enrichment of their oppressors, in the protests of citizens who demand laws that serve the common good, in the assembly of communities that refuse to abide by inequitable social hierarchies. Every act of defiance is a reclamation of agency, a demonstration that the oppressed are not passive subjects, but active participants in the shaping of society, and it signals that justice is not merely theoretical but practical, embodied in struggle and collective action. Revolutionary action is the necessary culmination of questioning and defiance. Justice cannot be achieved through petitions, compromise, or appeals to the moral conscience of the ruling class. It is achieved when the oppressed organize collectively, confront the structures of power, and restructure society to reflect the equitable distribution of wealth, rights, and opportunity. Revolutionary action transforms awareness into force, turning intellectual and moral critique into tangible social transformation. It demands unity among the working class, solidarity among the oppressed, and clarity of purpose grounded in the understanding that freedom, equality, and justice are inseparable. History demonstrates that those who accept injustice passively only perpetuate it, while those who rise in defiance have the power to dismantle entrenched systems of exploitation and replace them with structures that serve the collective rather than the privileged few. Revolutionary action is not impulsive or anarchic. It is organized, disciplined, and directed toward the systematic dismantling of inequality. It challenges not only the material power of the ruling class, but the ideological power that normalizes hierarchy, glorifies obedience, and obscures the reality of exploitation. True justice demands that the oppressed educate themselves in the principles of solidarity, strategy, and collective struggle, that they recognize the mechanisms of domination in economic, political, and cultural forms, and that they act decisively to replace these mechanisms with systems of accountability, equity, and human dignity. Justice requires courage, persistence, and the unyielding conviction that the social order is neither immutable nor divinely ordained, but the product of human labor, negotiation, and control, and therefore capable of transformation when the oppressed seize the means of their own liberation. The power of the ruling class does not rest solely on its wealth or its control of material resources. It rests on the fragmentation and disunity of the oppressed, on the ignorance and passivity that obedience cultivates, and on the isolation of individuals who confront exploitation alone. For centuries, the owners of capital have understood that a divided proletariat is easily dominated, that those who see themselves as competitors, enemies, or merely separate individuals are less capable of challenging entrenched hierarchies. It is consciousness, the awareness of one's position within the structure of class and the recognition of collective oppression, that transforms passive suffering into revolutionary potential. Consciousness is the light that reveals the mechanisms of exploitation, exposing how the labor of the many enriches the few, how laws and institutions reproduce inequality, and how submission is normalized as a virtue while justice is deferred. It is through consciousness that the working class comes to understand that their plight is not the result of personal failure, moral weakness, or chance, but the deliberate consequence of a system designed to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of the few. Yet awareness alone is insufficient if it does not lead to unity. Consciousness must be shared, nurtured, and transformed into collective understanding, because the structures of oppression are not dismantled by isolated acts of defiance, but by organized, coordinated, and sustained action. Unity among workers creates a force that can confront exploitation, challenge authority, and demand systemic change. It is the solidarity of the many that turns individual grievances into collective struggle, transforming personal suffering into political power. In the absence of unity, the ruling class continues to manipulate divisions, whether through wages, ethnicity, nationality, religion, or ideology, turning workers against each other to maintain dominance. When workers fail to see themselves as part of a larger class, when they perceive their struggles as separate from those of their peers, they are easily coerced into compliance, accepting scraps while the wealth produced collectively is hoarded by capital. Consciousness and unity together form the instruments of liberation. Consciousness illuminates the injustice. Unity channels the energy of that awareness into coordinated resistance. Historical examples abound. The strikes, uprisings, and movements that challenged oppression succeeded when workers recognized their shared interests and organized collectively. The factory floor, the field, the workshop, and the office can all become sites of struggle when individuals perceive themselves not as isolated laborers, but as part of a class whose collective action can challenge the power of capital. Education, discussion, and shared experience are essential to cultivating consciousness. while assembly, organization, and solidarity are essential to transforming consciousness into action. Workers must understand the economy not only in terms of wages and survival, but in terms of the relations of production, the extraction of surplus value, and the structures that perpetuate inequality. Only with this understanding can workers identify the levers of power, the points of vulnerability, and the methods by which they can assert their collective will. Unity does not imply uniformity or blind obedience. It implies coordinated effort toward shared objectives grounded in justice, equality, and the dismantling of exploitative hierarchies. It is a unity based on consciousness, informed by knowledge of the system and guided by strategy, not by ideology imposed from above or false promises of benevolent rulers. The ruling class fears this unity above all else because it undermines the mechanisms of control they have carefully constructed. The combination of workers' consciousness and solidarity transforms the labor force from a collection of isolated cogs in the machinery of exploitation into an organized material force capable of asserting its own interests. When workers recognize that their power lies not only in labor, but in the collective organization of labor. When they understand that cooperation and solidarity are not concessions but weapons, they begin to challenge the conditions that have long kept them oppressed. Meetings, unions, assemblies and networks become sites of revolutionary potential, incubators of strategy and instruments for reclaiming rights, resources and dignity. Consciousness enables workers to see the possibilities of systemic change. Unity gives them the strength to enact that change. Together, they form the only viable opposition to the entrenched dominance of capital, transforming the exploited into agents of liberation and ensuring that the fruits of labor benefit those who produce them rather than those who merely command. Justice is never freely bestowed by those who profit from oppression. It is never a concession granted voluntarily by those whose authority depends upon inequality. The rulers of society, whether through wealth, political power, or control of ideology, have no interest in justice for the masses, for such justice would inherently require the redistribution of resources, the equalization of opportunity, and the dismantling of the very structures that secure their dominance. History demonstrates that laws, courts, and institutions which claim to embody fairness are in practice instruments to maintain the privileges of the few while suppressing the needs of the many. Justice, therefore, cannot be awaited, requested, or hoped for as though it were an act of generosity from the powerful. It must be seized, claimed, and enforced by the oppressed themselves. Seizing justice demands organization because the forces arrayed against the many are formidable, structured, and relentless. Capital, political institutions, law enforcement, and ideology work in concert to maintain the status quo, to fragment resistance, and to pacify potential challengers. The unorganized individual, no matter how aware of injustice, is powerless before these mechanisms. Only the collective strength of a conscious, coordinated populace can confront the entrenched power of the ruling class. Organization transforms passive discontent into actionable power, channeling awareness into coordinated efforts that challenge authority and reclaim rights. Through unions, assemblies, committees, and networks, the oppressed can articulate common objectives, strategize responses, and mobilize action that is coherent, disciplined, and effective. This unity of purpose magnifies individual capacity, creating a material force capable of confronting the structures of exploitation and asserting control over the social, political, and economic conditions that define daily life. Justice, when seized, is no longer abstract or symbolic. It becomes concrete, tangible, and revolutionary. It requires not only the removal of unjust laws or practices, but the reconstruction of society on principles of equity, solidarity, and shared ownership. The organized many, acting together, can transform the conditions of labor, production, and governance, ensuring that wealth and power are no longer monopolized by a privileged minority, but distributed in accordance with the needs, labor, and dignity of all. Seizing justice is not a singular event, but a sustained process, requiring vigilance, discipline, and strategic action. The ruling class will resist, adapt, and retaliate, employing economic, political, and ideological weapons to preserve their dominance. Those who seek justice must therefore cultivate resilience, develop collective strategy, and maintain solidarity in the face of intimidation, propaganda, and repression. Every victory, no matter how small, is both a reclamation of rights and a step toward broader transformation, demonstrating that justice is not granted as charity but wrested through effort, sacrifice, and unity. The process of seizing justice also necessitates consciousness, for only those who understand the roots of oppression can identify the mechanisms through which it is maintained and the avenues through which it can be overturned. Awareness of exploitation, inequality, and ideological manipulation allows the organized many to target the centers of power, disrupt the structures that perpetuate injustice, and reconstruct institutions to reflect the collective will rather than private gain. Justice, when seized collectively, reshapes society, reallocates resources, and empowers the formerly oppressed to define the terms of their own existence. It converts labor from an instrument of exploitation into a means of collective prosperity, transforms obedience from a habit into a tool for solidarity, and replaces fear with confidence rooted in collective strength. Seizing justice also requires moral courage, for the path is fraught with resistance and danger, and the forces of the ruling class will employ every measure to maintain their privilege. Yet the organized many possess a force that cannot be ignored, a moral and material power grounded in numbers, unity, and awareness, capable of challenging both the economic and ideological domination of the few. Justice is therefore inseparable from organization, for without collective action, awareness remains impotent, defiance remains isolated, and the structures of oppression remain unchallenged. The act of seizing justice is itself revolutionary, for it undermines the foundations of authority that claim legitimacy while practicing inequality, and it establishes a new social order where the needs, rights, and dignity of the majority dictate the distribution of power and wealth. The organized many, acting in concert, convert knowledge into action, discontent into strategy, and oppression into liberation, ensuring that justice is no longer a theoretical concept, but a concrete, enforceable reality shaped by those who labor, suffer, and struggle. Comrades, the time for passive acceptance has long passed. Obedience has been taught, submission has been normalized, and justice has been withheld for generations, yet the chains that bind us are not eternal. We have seen that the system thrives on our ignorance, that the rulers rely on our division, and that inequality persists because we have been taught to defer, to obey, and to endure. But awareness is awakening, and the power of the organized many cannot be denied. True justice demands questioning, defiance, and revolutionary action. It cannot be waited for, it cannot be begged for, it must be seized by those who labor, suffer, and dream of liberation. Our unity and consciousness are the instruments of transformation, the force capable of overturning oppression, dismantling hierarchies, and reclaiming what has been stolen from us for centuries. The wealth we produce, the labor we endure, and the sacrifices we make are not the property of the few. They belong to the many, and through organization, solidarity, and action we will reclaim them. Comrades, the revolution is not a distant possibility, it is the historical necessity born of inequality, of exploitation, and of obedience taught in place of justice. Let us rise together, Let us educate ourselves and one another. Let us defy the false authority that seeks to keep us in chains, and let us seize the justice that has always been our right. In our hands lies the power to remake society, to redistribute wealth, to restore dignity, and to ensure that obedience serves humanity rather than enslaves it. Stand, organize, and act, for the time has come for the oppressed to no longer wait, but to claim the justice, equal it, and liberation that history demands.